On behalf of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, I want to warmly welcome our viewers to the virtual launch of the 2021 edition of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. Let me appeal to everyone to kindly minimize any potential distractions from any devices you may have around, as we are coming to you live on Zoom and Facebook. I anticipate a high-performance program this evening, but first, let's pay respect by just being still and silent as we play the national anthem of Trinidad and Tobago. The Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series is the Emancipation Support Committee's principal vehicle for public education and the sharing of ideas within the Pan-African Festival. This annual festival begins on African Liberation Day and culminates on Emancipation Day. That's from the 25th of May to the 1st of August annually. As usual with this and other events in the Pan-African Festival, we are partnering with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and the Arts, of course, Trinidad and Tobago. The lecture series began in the 1990s as the Emancipation Lecture Series, but in 1999, it was renamed to honor Kwame Ture, the revolutionary thinker, civil rights activist, and the Black Power leader who had transitioned the previous year. Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, born in Oxford Street, Belmont, Port of Spain. That is right here in Trinidad and Tobago, of course. The ESC has long petitioned the mayor of the city to rename this street Kwame Ture Street in honor of this great hero. The house where he was born still is occupied, and it is in its original architecture. A Kwame Ture Street on the Port of Spain map would definitely be a useful guide to visitors to this very historic site. Since the inception of the lectures, the Emancipation Support Committee has hosted the highest caliber of Pan-African thinkers and thinker activists to launch the series. I confidently make the claim that over the past 3 decades, the ESC has done more than any other institution, including the UWI, that's the University of the West Indies, in exposing the public, our national public, to the caliber of speakers as seen in this honor roll. As we scroll, I will just mention a few of these speakers. You have Trinbagonian Professor Tony Martin, author of the seminal books Race First and Amy Ashford Garvey. At one time, he was a leading Garveyite scholar in the Americas. We hosted world-renowned South African Winnie Mandela, one of the greatest freedom fighters of the 20th century. We had Nigerian Dr. Philip Emeagwali, inventor of the world's first supercomputer, without which the internet cannot function. African-American Professor of Black Studies, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, the founding director of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. And the last keynote speaker before the current pandemic was Dr. Anthony Browder, director of the Asa Restoration Project. Browder is the leading African-American Egyptologist and is currently excavating royal tombs of the 25th dynasty of Kemet, that's ancient Egypt. Some of these presentations are accessible on YouTube, so you can go there and take them in. The lectures are linked to Kwame Ture not only by name. The great revolutionary hero was a speaker for the Emancipation Lecture Series in the mid-1990s. Ture transitioned in 1998, and the following year, the ESC renamed the series of lectures in his honor. Let's now hear the voice, a little snippet, the voice of this great Pan-Africanist when he explains the nature of change during the We Shall Not Be Moved conference, which was held in 1988, courtesy Duke University of North Carolina.
When we speak of revolution, we mean here a change of values of the society. When we speak of reform, we speak of a change of the structure of the society. Thus, we can see here that revolution is fundamental, affecting the very values of the society. Reform is not fundamental and only touches the superficial aspects of the society. There was then a constant struggle inside a SNCC between those who were revolutionary and those who reformed. This, of course, demonstrated itself in the political arena by those who were anti-capitalist and those who were pro-capitalist. It demonstrated itself in practical activity. Those who were anti-capitalist understood that in order for Africans in this country to be free, the capitalist system, the American capitalist system, must be totally and completely destroyed. Those who reformed felt that some aspects of the capitalist system were unjust, for example, its racist aspects. And perhaps if we knocked out the racism and allowed some Africans to join the bourgeoisie, then the problem itself would be solved. This contradiction must be properly understood. At no time was the revolutionary aspect of SNCC dominant. At all times, the reform aspect of SNCC was dominant. And certainly we can see that today from the activities of those who are no longer in SNCC.
Change, of course, is the only constant in life, even on a personal level. The ESC now takes this opportunity to commiserate with the family, the friends, and personal colleagues of Anthony Mackenzie, who recently transitioned this life. Mackenzie was a long-standing member of the Belmont Freetown Cultural Arts and the Folk Performing Company, which was founded by Miss Christine Mark. To honor his memory, we feature the group's performance in the 2015 launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. Mackenzie is the male dancer in this routine. Let's take in this performance. a performance. I hope you could feel the very powerful vibrations and the spirit as I would have felt them. Rest in peace, Brother Anthony. We now come to the main event in the program. We want to warmly welcome Dr. Rupert Lewis, Professor Emeritus of Political Thought in the Department of Government at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies, Jamaica, to deliver the feature address. Professor Lewis has lectured for over 40 years in his field. Moreover, he has an international reputation as a scholar of the Garvey movement and the Caribbean radicalism in the 20th and 21st centuries. He has been an activist for reparatory justice since the 1980s and is a member of the Jamaica's National Council on Reparation. He served as chairman of the Friends of Liberty Hall, which spearheaded the renovation and reconstruction of Garvey's Kingston Liberty Hall in 2003. He also served as a member of the Council of the Institute of Jamaica from 1997 to 2020. From 1997 to 2020. He still chairs the editorial board of Caribbean Quarterly, that is the UWI's oldest journal. Recently, he served as a research fellow in the P.J. Patterson Center for African Caribbean Advocacy at the UWI, and that institute promotes relationships between Africa and the Caribbean, and of course, P.J. Patterson was a former Prime Minister of Jamaica. For his services to Jamaica, the government of Jamaica awarded him the Order of Distinction, Commander Class. He is the author and the editor of many publications. Among them, I would highlight only these important works on three of the Caribbean icons of Pan-Africanism. There's Garvey, his work and impact, which was published in 1988. Another on Garvey's is Garvey, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, published in 1991. Then there is the Walter Rodney's Intellectual and Political Thought, published in 1998. And George Padmore, Pan-African Revolutionary, published in 2009. Professor Lewis has chosen to speak on the topic, 100 Years from Marcus Garvey to Black Lives Matter. The topic, of course, explores aspects of the theme of this year's Pan-African Festival, which is advancing Pan-African solidarity towards a balanced world. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished scholar address us this evening. Let us welcome Professor Lewis. Over to you, Professor Lewis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Claudius Fergus. And I'd like to also thank the chair of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, Sister Zakia Wadada. The Caribbean region owes a debt of gratitude to the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago for their steadfastness in organizing annual commemorative events, and I have attended a few in the pre-COVID period. Other countries have caught on. Canada now marks emancipation, and the United States recently acknowledged June 19th, as Emancipation Day in the new capacity as a public holiday. Recognizing Juneteenth is a tribute to the ancestors over many generations and the contemporary work of the Black Lives Matter movement. In the 20th century, there were two waves of Black power in the Caribbean region. The two waves I discuss, firstly, the post-World War I unrest in the United States and the Caribbean among Black people. And the second is on Black power as the second wave that came about 50 years after the Garvey, high point of the Garvey movement, and which is 50 years from this generation. And I highlight and focus on the 1970 Trinidad and Tobago Revolution, Black Power Revolution, which was marked last year. I conclude with remarks pertinent to 2021 and the theme of this year's Emancipation Support Committee activities. So I deal with the first wave. There was the post-war World War I, 1914-1918 unrest of the West Indian soldiers who returned from the battlefields of Europe, Egypt, Palestine, and Syria to find the democratic liberties they had fought for denied to them in their homelands, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in many parts of Africa. Some of them joined the Garvey movement, which grew rapidly in the post-World War I years. Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League mushroomed throughout the Caribbean as ideas of Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism took root. The 1918-1919 unrest in the West Indies paralleled riots in Black communities in the United States against racism. These youthful veterans joined with other progressive people to lay the foundation for the Garvey movement in Trinidad and Tobago. And I quote here from the work of the late Tony Martin, one of the lecturers in this series, who wrote of the Garvey movement in Trinidad and Tobago and set the foundations for further research on its crucial importance in the political awakening of its people. According to Tony Martin, there was some 29 branches in Trinidad and Tobago. Let me call some of the locations: Balandra Bay, Carapichaima, Caroni, Cedros, Chaguanas, Cauro, Dabadi, Gasparillo, Guayco, Aere Village, La Brea, Los Bajos, Mucurapo St. James, Marabella, Matura, Pinal, Port of Spain, Princess Town, Rio Claro, St. Magdalene, St. Mary, San Fernando, Tableland, Victoria Village, Williamsville, among others. Although the term Black Power had not yet been popularized, the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, approved by the UNIA Convention in 1920, 101 years ago, was unquestionably a collective statement of Black Power. And there were representatives of Trinidad at this convention. The Declaration of Rights of 1920 had 54 points, which summarized the conditions of Blacks throughout the world and the programmatic measures to achieve human rights for Africans and people of African descent. The movement in each country had the obligation to expand and even modify the declaration according to their particular circumstances. So that the movement in Trinidad, the Garvey movement in Trinidad, was not simply an extension of what was taking place in New York. It had organic roots in the population. This declaration is the most comprehensive document on human rights that was developed 28 years before the United Nations Declaration. The Garvey movement emphasized the global or universal nature of the exploitation and subjection of Africans as a result of the transatlantic trade, slavery, and colonialism. Transformation required world reorganization. Garvey expressed this in his essay, The Negro's Place in World Reorganization, written in 1923. In his words, gradually, we are approaching the time when the Negro peoples of the world will have either to consciously, through their own organization, go forward to the point of destiny as laid out by themselves, or must sit quiescently and see themselves pushed back into the mire of economic serfdom, to be ultimately crushed by the grinding mill of exploitation and be exterminated ultimately by the strong hand of prejudice, end quote. 100 years ago, on May 31st and June 1st, a prosperous Black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was razed to the ground by a white mob, and 300 Black people were killed, and some 10,000 left homeless. This gives you some idea of the climate in which the Garvey movement took place, developed, and in which Garvey did organizing work. Other massacres took place in East St. Louis in 1917, Chicago 1919, Elaine, Arkansas, where in 1919 a white mob attacked sharecroppers. Riots took place in Washington, D.C., also in that year, 1919, and in Rosewood, Florida, 1923. Another Black community, this time in Florida, was destroyed. Among Caribbean activists living in the United States at the time were the 29-year-old Claude McKay, poet and novelist of the Harlem Renaissance, and 32-year-old Marcus Garvey. They responded in fighting spirit to the rise in white mob violence against Blacks in many cities during the year 1919. Claude McKay was then working as a dining car waiter on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Marcus Garvey was busy restructuring the UNIA and had added the business arm, African Communities League. He was also publishing the weekly Negro World newspaper. Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die, written in 1919, has become famous and was recited by the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, but was not attributed to McKay. Churchill recited this when the Germans were on the offensive against Britain in World War II. McKay's poem, If We Must Die, is striking in its militancy, and I quote, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back," unquote. In the East St. Louis riots in 1917, 39 Blacks and 9 whites were killed following a labor dispute. Garvey, who had just completed a tour of 38 of the United States, was defiant, and I quote Garvey again, "The East St. Louis riot will go down in history as one of the bloodiest outrages against mankind for which any class of people could be held guilty. This is no time for fine words, but a time to lift one's voice against the savagery of a people who claim to be dispensers of democracy. For 300 years, Black people of America have given their lifeblood to make the Republic the first among the nations of the world. And all along this time, there has never been even 1 year of justice, but on the contrary, a continuous round of oppression. At one time it was slavery, at another time lynching and burning. This is a crime against the laws of humanity, It is a crime against the laws of the nation. It is a crime against nature and a crime against the God of all mankind, end quote. These words apply equally to the Tulsa 1921 massacre of 100 years ago. Some 370,000 African-American soldiers had fought in Europe in World War I in segregated conditions to defend American democracy, only to return to the horror of white mob violence and racism. Many of these soldiers were responsive to Garvey's message, and many of these young men joined the movement. Garvey raised money to assist the victims of the violence and redoubled his efforts to build the organization in the United States and globally. Garvey's most impactful years were 1916 to the early 1920s in the United States. These years saw a huge mobilization push and the preparation of the organizational and financial infrastructure for the 1920 convention in Madison Square Gardens, New York, one of several conventions held throughout the 1920s and 1930s. By the early 1920s, the movement had over 5 million members and more than 1,000 branches, and was organized in 37 countries. This was Black Lives Matter transnational. Some 800 branches were in the United States, and most of these were in the South of the United States. This is a phenomenal achievement given entrenched racism in the Southern states, not only entrenched racism, but daily violence against Black people, which occurred and which I have documented in terms of some of the more outrageous aspects. 100 years later, activists in the Black Lives Matter movement waved the red, black, and green flag of the UNIA in their demonstrations, especially after the televised murder of George Floyd. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement staged the largest demonstrations seen in United States history. The spirit of both McKay and Garvey is reminiscent of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 throughout the United States. Now I turn to the second wave. 50 years after the heyday of the Garvey movement, the second wave of Black Power happened in different parts of the Caribbean region and developed on their own steam, so to speak, but was simultaneously coming under the influence of the ideological leaders and nationwide public protests of civil rights and Black Power in the United States. Kwame Ture, who lived from 1941 to 1998, was among the outstanding leaders of this phase of Black Power in the United States. His contribution to the voting rights drive among Black people in the South is particularly significant today in American politics. In 1965, when Carmichael and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee put their lives on the line in the voter registration drive in the Southern states. African Americans today in 2020 also put their lives on the line in the effort to bring out the vote against the Trump administration, and their efforts were successful politically. The Black Power movement emerged in the Caribbean when the generation which had benefited from the expansion of education with the coming of independence recognized that political independence had left intact many of the social, economic, and racial legacies of colonialism. Black Power was therefore a collective effort to radicalize political independence by the young cohort of the population, ranging from youths in their teenage up to their 20s. And at that time, when you're in your mid to late 20s, you're regarded as pretty old. It was an effort to devise new strategies for nation building that would confront the many manifestations of racial, social, and economic inequalities, which included the suppression of African religious and cultural institutions. Where colonial rule continued in the region, Black Power was a challenge to the system. Black Power was therefore also the slogan for independence in those territories in the Caribbean still under British, French, and Dutch rule. Black Power ideologies had a flexible definition of Black that was not exclusively linked to African descent, and it was widened to include all oppressed groups. This was an attempt to deal with oppression across ethnic lines in multi-ethnic societies. It became a contentious issue in Trinidad and Guyana, where large Indian populations had worked on sugar plantations since the 19th century. Black Power appealed to indigenous groups who embraced their own ethno-cultural, religious roots in keeping with the ideas of Black Power advocates. I turn to Trinidad, 1970. The intensive period of national mobilization in Trinidad and Tobago between February and April 1970 was the high point of the Black Power movement in the Caribbean region. The National Joint Action Committee had been formed at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus in February 1969 and was one of several organizations in Trinidad and Tobago actively engaged in the struggle. The leaders of NJAC were Macandal Daga, then known as Geddes Granger, Kafra Cambon, then known as Dave Darbo, well known to all in the Emancipation Support Trinidad Committee and throughout the region and in many parts of the African diaspora. Carl Blackwood, an engineering student from Jamaica. Ayagoro Ome, Kelshal Bodhi, Russell and Dalcio. Geddes Granger, who grew up in Laventille in the cultural milieu of spiritual Baptist and Orisha practices, as well as the creativity of the steel pan, had renamed himself Macandal Daga in honor of two anti-slavery heroes. Macandal was the spiritual inspirer of the Haitian Revolution, and Daga led an anti-slavery revolt in Trinidad and was executed in 1837. When he went to UWI St. Augustine campus, Granger was a mature student with leadership skills and deep social capital in urban communities around Port of Spain. He was also a powerful orator, and he created an outreach literacy program which saw students going out into the poor areas along the Eastern Main Road. By the late 60s, the vocabulary of Black Power and the critique of economic imperialism, the hostility to white racism in commercial and banking enterprises, as well as in the Catholic Church, were being exposed. Prime Minister Eric Williams, a distinguished historian and critic of British colonial rule, had led Trinidad and Tobago to independence in 1962, but large numbers of young people felt he had not done enough to transform Trinidad during the 14 years the People's National Movement had been at the helm, albeit part of it under British colonial rule. During the crisis of 1970, the anti-colonial leader turned to repressive ways, locking up the leaders of the movement, among them Geddes Granger, Dave Darbo, now known as Kafra Cambon, trade unionist Clive Nunes, George Weeks, and soldiers Rafik Shah and Rex LaSalle, who refused to take military action against the demonstrators. These leaders represented thousands of young people who had taken to the streets in marches and demonstrations. They were determined to dismantle the multiple legacies of colonialism and racism. The February Revolution was characterized by a series of explosive mass actions between February and April 1970, seen nowhere else in the Caribbean. The demonstrations in Trinidad marked a contestation between a young Black population with considerable idealism and willingness to risk their lives for transformation on the one hand, and Black political leadership on the other, that was anti-colonial, was committed to reforms, that had engaged the British and especially the Americans over the naval base of Chaguaramas, and saw itself as part of the Bandung Afro-Asian movement and later the non-aligned movement. Among the highlights of the Black Power Revolution was the February 26, 1970 anniversary of the Sir George Williams University protest. Students at that university had demonstrated destroying the computer center in protest against the racist acts of a biology professor. NJAC led a demonstration in Port of Spain in solidarity with the students who had come from all over the Caribbean, including Trinidad and Tobago, but they were on trial in Montreal. Demonstrators staged a sit-in in the Roman Catholic Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, and this resulted in much controversy and was deemed by the press as sacrilegious. But for the demonstrators, the church reflected the racial hierarchy of Trinidad and Tobago with its white-led bishops at the time and priests. From the church, demonstrators went on to the Royal Bank of Canada, a symbol of Canadian financial power, and on to Frederick Street in the business district of Port of Spain. The significance of this demonstration was that the struggle against racism in Canada was transformed into a struggle against foreign-owned businesses and racism in employment practices in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in the banking system. On March 12, 1970, some 6,000 Afro-Trinidadians marched to Caroni, the area of sugar estates and Indian small farmers. This was the most significant demonstration because the predominantly Black demonstrators were seeking some kind of alliance with the Indian population in the rural areas on the sugar estates and those who were working their own plots of land. In this regard, Caribbean Black Power sought to bridge the ethnic divide. This was a high-risk action as Bades Mirage, leader of the All Trinidad Sugar Workers Union and the leader of the opposition Democratic Labour Party, had threatened the use of violence if the demonstrators ventured into central Trinidad. Black Power, insofar as it tried to develop multi-ethnic linkages, represented a challenge to conventional politics in Trinidad and Guyana, where political parties had come to power on the basis largely of ethnic mobilization and support. Later in the 1970s, the United Labour Front also reflected the determination to bridge the divide in the link between the oilfield workers trade union and the sugar unions. Geddes Granger led most of the demonstrations in the heady months of February to April 1970. And he not only mobilized under the banner of Black Power in Trinidad, but spent a week walking the villages of the neighboring island of Tobago and gaining support, thereby ensuring that both islands were engaged. A high point of the Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago was the mobilization on April 9, 1970, of over 30,000 people who attended the funeral of Basil Davis. Basil Davis was a demonstrator who was shot by the police as he was protesting the detention of another demonstrator. This demonstration made it palpably clear that NJAC controlled the streets, and this scares the supporters of Eric Williams' People's National Movement, and even Williams himself. A state of emergency was declared on April 21, 1970, and over 100 people were arrested, among them the NJAC leadership and all those identified with the series of marches and demonstrations by intelligence sources. Daga and other leaders were arrested for 6.5 months, and their detention damaged the movement. In 1971, he was again arrested during another state of emergency imposed during a period of industrial unrest, and he was imprisoned for 9 months. In 1970, Prime Minister Eric Williams was faced with a combination of peaceful mass protests led by young people, an army mutiny, and after 1970 with armed guerrilla warfare. In Williams's address on March 23, 1970 to the nation, he said, and I quote, "But the fundamental feature of the demonstrations was the insistence on Black dignity, the manifestations of Black consciousness, and the demands for Black economic power. The entire population must understand that these demands are perfectly legitimate and are entirely in the interest of the community as a whole. If this is Black power, then I am for Black power. The question now is how to provide the means by which these legitimate demands can be satisfied." His address had little effect on the Black Power movement and its supporters, but it helped to reassure his supporters in the ruling People's National Movement that he was still in control of the nation. Williams called in the 750-person regiment to enforce the emergency. However, Lieutenants Rex LaSalle and Rafik Shah refused to follow the orders. Shah said, and I quote, "When the government becomes unpopular, we are not supposed to go out and oppress people on behalf of the government. So we took a stand that we were making the army a negative force. We would take over the army and ensure that it would not go out and terrorize our people. And this is why we had the uprising on April 24th, end quote." There was counteraction from other members of the regiment, which prevented the rebels from effecting their plan. The Coast Guard fired at the convoy of rebel soldiers, which resulted in one soldier being killed. The rebel soldiers seem to have had second thoughts when faced with the death of one of their own, and their panic and the absence of any plan to take power aborted the rebellion for which Eric Williams' government was prepared. In response to the army mutiny, Prime Minister Eric Williams accessed arms from the United States and Venezuela, and also sought help from Jamaica and Guyana. The majority of Burnham's cabinet members, however, opposed assistance. Williams had contacted Venezuela, Britain, and the United States to help him militarily, and he was living bunker style at his residence. Contingency planning had been taken to fly Eric Williams out of Trinidad in the event of a coup, and the United States and Venezuela were prepared to intervene. That the overthrow of the Eric Williams regime was aborted was contingent on the military rebels getting cold feet, having had no plan. Eric Williams used the violence of the state to crush NJAC and later on the National Union of Freedom Fighters, which drew its support from a mixture of educated middle class and poor youth and women, young men and women. Enough shared NJAC's ideological position and mobilization efforts, but felt that marches were not sufficient, and so to develop bloc/community parliaments, where young people were able to formulate their views, express their positions with respect to how post-colonial Trinidad should be reorganized. They differed from NJAC in their determination in their determination to respond to the violence of the state with violence. They attacked police stations to get guns and robbed banks to finance their operations. Nuff was of the view that the methods of mass mobilization undertaken by NJAC had failed, as the capacity of the Black Power movement to bring large numbers of population on its side had passed. But Nuff to experience failure, faced with the overwhelming firepower of the state and the fact that the population was not behind a violent overthrow of the Eric Williams government. The conditions did not exist for sustained guerrilla warfare in Trinidad. And when oil prices went up, Prime Minister Eric Williams was able to announce social and economic programs to meet some of the demands of the unemployed and the working class. Nuff lasted from 1972 until 1974, and one estimate puts their numbers at 300. The combination of these forms of mass struggle, from street protests to attempts at armed insurrection, led to dynamic shifts in government policies, resulting in Eric Williams embarking urgently on the development of state ownership in the petroleum and banking sectors of the economy. Deploying the carrot and stick approach, he coupled these policy initiatives with strong police action against activists and sections of the Black Power movement. He put the leaders of the Black Power movement in prison and court-martialed the mutinous soldiers, deliberately using military officers from Nigeria. The impact of 1970. Trinidad Black Power 1970 had a huge impact on the Black Power movement in the rest of the Southern Caribbean. Neighboring Grenada had thousands of its citizens living in Trinidad, and the Black Power movement there influenced the New Drill movement and scared Eric Garvey. In a few years, the NJM was to lead the armed overthrow of the Eric Garvey regime, which heralded the revolution of 1979-1983. The impact was also felt in Barbados, that had a form of apartheid. And I quote here from the British High Commissioner to Barbados, who wrote in 1971, and I quote, "More and more of the old white Barbadian commercial families are coming to accept, however reluctantly, that their economic future depends on their ability to accept the realities of the present and to forget the pleasant past," his words, in which the black man accepted his subordinate status. The perceptible progress in Barbados is probably in some part due to the Trinidad Troubles. And the word troubles is instructive because in the back of the British High Commissioner's mind is really the Irish situation, which we refer to as the Troubles. So the Trinidad Troubles have brought home to the white Barbadian population the problems they will face if they are unwilling to come to terms with the aspirations of the large majority of the population, unquote. The Black Power movement helped to shift public opinion in favor of recognition of Cuba. In 1972, Michael Manley, Forbes Burnham, Eric Williams, and Errol Barrow opened the diplomatic relations with Cuba in defiance of both the United States and the Organization of American States. The Black Power protests throughout the region helped to open up space, not only for the state to implement social and economic reforms, but ushered in cultural changes with heightened awareness about Africa and its diaspora. The decolonization of the curricula in the humanities and the social sciences at the University of the West Indies went into high gear in the 1970s and 1960s and 1970s. Mention must be made here of the New World Group, in which the economist Lloyd Best and historian James Millett played prominent roles before their political divergence. Other important thinkers associated with the New World Group publishing in their journal New World were Sylvia Wynter, Jamaican novelist and thinker, later professor at Stanford University, who in many essays argued for a rethinking of what it meant to be human, rejecting and critically engaging Western humanism. George Beckford's book, Persistent Poverty, assessed the impact of the plantation system in the Americas, analyzing data demonstrating the systemic nature of poverty. Barbadian novelist and essayist George Lamming edited very important special issues of the New World Journal for Barbados and Guyana's independence, with his customary sharpness of mind and his critique of the way in which the development process was underway in the region. Over 50 years ago, a group of academics came together at the Mona campus of the University of West Indies and formed the African Studies Association of the West Indies. ASAWI, as it was called, was led by the literary scholar Arthur Drayton, a Trinidadian, who introduced the study of African literature in the undergraduate curriculum. The literary scholar and linguist Maureen Warner did pioneering work on the Yoruba, Hausa, Kikongo languages in Trinidad and the Caribbean. Maureen Warner also formed the dance group Omagini, translated Children of Africa, which performed the Yoruba songs of the descendants of elders who had come as indentured labor in Trinidad in the 19th century. These songs and the drumming and dance traditions associated with them, she had recorded in Trinidad communities in the 1960s and 1970s, not without some harassment of the Black Power, of her as a Black Power activist by the police in Trinidad as she went into the villages and urban communities. The work and activities of various Orisha collectives in Trinidad have over time ensured the intergenerational practices in singing, drumming, such as the Yoruba Drum Village Festival, which I listened to last Sunday. And the Yoruba tradition in Trinidad has influenced the production of artistic work, such as the dramas created by Aintu Springer, and it has contributed significantly to the enrichment of Calypso. In the 1960s, poet historian Kwame Ture of Barbados joined the history department at Mona, and the appearance of his trilogy, Rites of Passage 1967, Masks 1968, and Islands 1969, bore testimony to the awakening of a Pan-African consciousness. But Brathwaite was an intellectual leader as poet, historian, editor, and his experience of living and working in Ghana had a lasting impact on his work. Also involved with the African Studies Association of the West Indies was another Trinidad scholar, Mervyn Allain, who was a leading sociolinguistic of Creole languages or Caribbean mother tongue languages. He went on to author the important volume entitled The Construction and Representation of Race and Ethnicity in the Caribbean and the World, a much neglected work of his later years. Participating for a brief period in 1968 in ASAWI was Dr. Walter Rodney, whose classic work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and the Groundings with My Brothers, his writings on Black Power in Jamaica, have recently been reissued by Versa Press. And we are promised over the next 2 years that collections of his essays will begin appearing sometime in 2022. So when the Jamaican government banned Rodney from returning to Jamaica in 1968, it was a plus for the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where Walter Rodney is associated with the Dar es Salaam School of African Historiography. Rodney's lesser-known book, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, 1545 to 1800, based on his thesis, and aspects of the history of Tanzania and Mozambique, which he wrote, works on the partition of Africa and the history of Guyana, represent some of the best scholarship of that generation of Africa and Africa diaspora activists. At UWI St. Augustine, the late Dr. Fitzbaptiste developed an African and African diaspora program. And towards the end of his career, he organized a conference on the much neglected Trinidad-born Pan-Africanist George Padmore. And he led the co-editing with me of the volume consisting of a selection of essays. This brief summary represents some of the foundational work at UWI with respect to Africa and its diaspora. The Emancipation Support Committee has acted on all 10 points of the Caribbean Reparation Commission well before these were developed in 2013. There have been extraordinarily strong on 2 of these points, 2 of the 10 points. These are firstly the African Knowledge Program. The Caribbean Reparation Committee points in point 7 states, and I quote, "The forced separation of Africans from their homeland has resulted in cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging. Denied the right in law to life and divorced by space from the source of historic self, Africans have craved the right to return and knowledge of the root, R-O-U-T-E, to roots, the root to roots. A program of action is required to build bridges of belonging. Such projects as school exchanges and culture tours, community artistic and performance programs, entrepreneurial and religious engagements, as well as political interaction, are required in order to neutralize the void created by slave voyages," unquote. Point 8 emphasizes the need for psychological rehabilitation. And I quote, "For over 400 years, Africans and their descendants were classified in law as non-human, chattel, property, and real estate. This history has inflicted massive psychological trauma upon African-descended populations," end quote. The CARICOM 10-point plan for reparation is an excellent framework for reparative justice work. Let me remind you of 8 of the 8 other points. The full demand for a full formal apology, repatriation, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, development of cultural institutions such as museums to educate our population about our history, dealing with the public health crisis in hypertension and type 2 diabetes, and the eradication of illiteracy. There's also the transfer of technology. There have been several important initiatives that have strengthened Africa-Caribbean cooperation in educational institutions at the tertiary level. UWI's Vice Chancellor Hilary Beckles has initiated a series of programs of collaboration between universities in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa and UWI. The most dynamic collaborator so far is the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Pan-African Thought, led by Professor Adekeye Adebayo, which has been in existence for 5 years. Since the COVID-19 crisis, UWI trained epidemiologists, immunologists, Doctors, nurses, and our scientists in gene editing have been playing a major role in the pandemic. So have Caribbean governments. The global COVID-19 pandemic has brought into sharp focus the inequalities within the United States, disadvantaging African Americans, indigenous populations, and the crisis has hit working people very hard. Highlighted also are the inequalities between a few countries and the rest of the world. While the United States and Europe have stockpiles of vaccine, many times the size of their population, many countries have only very small supplies and low vaccination rates, especially risky in the face of the Delta variant of COVID-19. In this regard, Cuba's development of their own vaccine is a lesson to us in the rest of the Caribbean of what can be done with very limited financial resources, very limited foreign exchange. Cuba is doing this under an economic embargo that has hit the people of that island extremely hard. The most recent UWI initiative is the P.J. Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy, founded by both Vice Chancellor and P.J. Patterson in 2020. And that has focused, as our chair said, on the relations between the African Union and CARICOM, seeking to forge cooperation to reform the global system. We are at a time when there is need for what Garvey referred to, and I mentioned at the start of this talk, as world reorganization, to engage the pressing issues of economic inequality, of debt, to enhance trade and development, to deal with climate change, which is particularly challenging for the Caribbean area in the hurricane season that we are now in, and the imbalance in access to science and technology. There needs to be joint working groups in the African Union and CARICOM, collaborating in all the international institutions in which we are represented, collaborations over science and technology, and in the wide range of creative expression in the arts, film, music, and sports. Emancipation for Garvey was always a time of stock taking and setting goals. And so it is and has been for the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. Other Caribbean countries need to urgently develop and implement the strategic initiatives for Africa and its diaspora for transformation in the lives of our people in this century. And there's no better time to do this than in marking the anniversary of emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Professor Lewis for such a wide-ranging talk. He has educated and enlightened us on several issues and offered us food on many others. Of course, he framed his talk within a context of two waves of civil rights struggle since World War I, from World War I to the 1960s, and then from the 1960s to the present time. In the beginning, we see how Marcus Garvey would have harnessed the disaffection and activist energies of young war veterans who largely led the initial stages of the first wave of demands for rights and justice in the Caribbean. In the second wave, we are mostly familiar here in Trinidad and Tobago with the local impacts of the Black Power revolution, but Professor Lewis has expanded the impacts across the Caribbean and of course much, much more. Let me at this time recognize Brother Alpha Ture, son of Kwame Ture, who is in the Zoom audience. Welcome, Brother Alpha. We are indeed honored by your presence. We will now open the lines for questions and comments. I have a few, but I will give way to people in the audience. I'm sure they're raring to go. I would start with one question that came in from a concerned Zoom member in the audience there. She wants to know, Dr. Lewis, if you're making a distinction between Trinidad and Tobago, so you will deal with that. But just let me explain here now that each person would have a maximum of 1 minute to comment or pose a question. I know you may not have a question as such, but you're free to comment or to query any aspect of Professor Lewis's presentation, but you have just 1 minute to do so, so that we can expand the participation to as many people as possible. Of course, you can come back, so one question at a time. If you're on Facebook, you can post your comments and questions, and they will be forwarded to Professor Lewis, or if of a basic nature, they may be addressed by our team. So we would open the lines. For those people on Zoom, you can speak directly to Professor Lewis. Just give us a hand up and we would recognize you. So in the meantime, Professor Lewis, can you speak to the concerned person? I think this, from Clayton Clark. This comes from Clayton Clark of Tobago on Zoom.
I don't make a distinction, certainly in terms of the state, but there's a distinction in terms of the ethnic composition of the two islands, and there are specific histories that attend to Tobago, which would mean that you can't treat Tobago in the same way that you treat Trinidad because of the specificities of Tobago's history. So in terms of the idea of sovereignty and the state, yes, but one has to respect differences of the trajectory and the social ethnic composition and histories, the diversity as such of Tobago as distinct from Trinidad.
Okay, I know that I forwarded Clayton Clark's question, but he has his hand up. So could we recognize Clayton Clark? Maybe he might want to expand on his concern so that Professor Lewis will further address. Clayton Clark, Renee, could you recognize Clayton Clark? And Clayton Clark, could you unmute? Welcome.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. Yes, well, I know sometimes we say Trinidad and we sometimes really mean Trinidad and Tobago. So I wasn't really trying to argue that point. But in terms of the history which you just explained, and the whole, because while there might be the Black Power movement in Trinidad, we don't, what was happening in Tobago might be a different matter. So that is why I was really asking,
okay,
you know, if there was a movement here as well.
Yeah, there was a movement. There was definitely a movement in Trinidad, in Tobago.
Okay.
That again, I don't think it has been sufficiently documented in the way that the movement in Trinidad has been.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Brother Clayton. Thank you very much. Do we have any other hands up? In the meantime, I would direct a concern here of mine to Professor Lewis. Professor Lewis, I see a direct link between Garvey's Declaration of Rights in 1920 and Haiti's Independence Constitution of 1805. Would you agree that there is some continuity in terms of the ideas of rights as defined in that Constitution 1805 and in the UNIA's Declaration 1920? And secondly, to me, the Declaration of Rights, Garvey's Declaration, was the first such declaration also of the rights of women and children. Would you agree and would you comment on that?
Yes, certainly. I think it's good that the Haitian Constitution is mentioned in this capacity, since it would have to take pride of place in terms of the rights of our people, even preceding the 1920 Declaration. So I don't have a dispute there with that issue. And if you notice the extent to which Garvey refers in so many of his speeches back to the Haitian Revolution as the first free act that led to the liberation and the formation of Black nation state in the Western Hemisphere. So yes, I think that's an important precedent which influenced the Garvey movement. The question of the rights of women and children, very important in that there is UNIA literature on the role of children. There was a program, there were programs on which basis they learned about African history. They learned about the way to treat the Bible in terms of the African presence, a whole range of questions that had to do with children. So, and then you had the structures of the UNIA, the juvenile divisions. Every UNIA branch had a juvenile division. The role of women, that was an important issue. And the women at between the 1922 and 1923 convention played an increasingly, made their role even more than what the constitution of the UNIA had guaranteed. And therefore, one has to, and fortunately there is good research that's now going on the grassroots women in the Garvey movement in different parts of the world. Work has been done on the South African question. Work has been done on Cuba. Work has been done on the Jamaican side. So there's need for understanding of how the gender question was treated. But I would argue that Garvey's first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, in her own right as a feminist, as a Black feminist of the time, had views that were in advance of even Garvey himself when it came to issues of gender. And there were other women along those lines, in that the right to vote. Amy Ashwood was at that famous Manchester conference in 1945, which George Padmore organized. And her speech to that conference again indicates the strength of her own determination as an advocate of the rights of women.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about women, so I'm glad that you have introduced that, in the context in which you have put it. Women in the history of the civil rights struggle within the context of the two phases that you have outlined. How important would you say were Caribbean women on a whole, Caribbean women, both within the Caribbean and let us say at least one other theater of civil rights in the United States, Caribbean-born women, how important were they? And could you identify some of these besides the Amy's, besides Amy Ashwood and also Amy Jacques? I would agree.
Amy Ashwood, Amy Jacques, Rhoda Reddock has written on Elma Francois and written on some of the other Caribbean women who were active in the 1930s and 40s. There is Henrietta Vinton Davis, who is an interesting character, who was international organizer of the UNIA and who worked with Frederick Douglass and then came over and worked with Garvey. There were many other women involved in the 1930s and 40s in Jamaica. There's Amy Bailey. Garvey seemed to have had interest in people who share that name, which seemed to have been popular at the time. And she was involved in the working class and middle class efforts in the anti-colonial movement in Jamaica. Those are some of the names that come to mind, but again, another generation of younger scholars have been documenting grassroots women in different locations of the United States, perusing not only the Negro world to see reports. Only today, I was in touch with people in Cuba who are working on the Garveyites who were on Garvey's trip to Cuba in 1921, which is 100 years ago, and his trip to Costa Rica. And those anniversaries are being marked. But gender was an important aspect of the structure of the movement, but more work needs to be done to popularize those women who were active, for example, in some of the 29 branches that I listed. We don't know who the women were in Trinidad and Tobago who were active in these branches. Were there women who were there? So work needs to be done by a younger generation of scholars to bring to the fore both the men and women who were active on the ground in these branches and divisions, and what did they do, who were they, and so on. So that's ongoing work which hasn't been done satisfactorily since the demise of Tony Martin in terms of the Trinidad Garvey movement.
Okay, so I have some questions here, and I'm going to throw some of them at you. Some I might combine. This is a question that comes from Facebook. It's from Sonia Noel, and she would like to know, how would you describe Eric Williams's response to the Black Power movement, whether that was an appropriate response? Let me see. Okay, and go ahead with that in the meantime. Somebody has asked a question linking the bullet fronts. I think that might be an interesting one, but that would be, yeah, go ahead with that one, Professor Lewis. I'm trying to manage.
Okay, let me go on the Sonia Noel's comment. The question of appropriate response cannot be answered either good or bad in that sense. It really, when you have a movement of thousands of people on the ground who are raising issues critical to the society, this creates a crisis, and a crisis for governance and for those who hold power. The paradox is that Eric Williams is one of the most progressive prime ministers, but the generation of 70 was seeking to push the society much further than it has either gone. And in that context of a political struggle, the Williams's response is of a political leader who is sympathetic to aspects of what the movement is calling for, the more liberal aspects of it in terms of dignity, some of the social and economic issues. But as Williams himself, in his book From Columbus to Castro, the moment in Trinidad in 1970 was a moment of contestation of the limits of post-colonial independence and what it had failed to do with respect to the persistence of racism, the inequality, and so on. People did not feel that the rate and pace of change was adequate. And this was, interestingly, triggered by an external event, the Sir George Williams event. But when people began to look at Trinidad, they became critical. My wife, Maureen Warner Lewis, always tells me of when she went to one of the Catholic schools in Trinidad, where that had started to accept children from primary schools and so on. And the nun looked at her and said, "You are from the primary school, no doubt." That sense of you not being in the right place as a Black person would not be familiar to the current generation, but it was part of the experience, lived experience of the generation of 1970. So in answering your question, Eric Williams, in his position as the Prime Minister of Trinidad, did what he had to do in relation to a movement which challenged fundamentally the independence arrangements. Now, Hilary Beckles has made the important point that the legacies of colonialism could not have been dealt with in such a short space of time. And hence the demand, Eric Williams himself was critiquing the way in which Britain had left the West Indies without any significant or even not so significant level of funds after 300 years or more for some of the islands. So there was a handicap which Eric Williams had with respect to Britain taking everything out and leaving little. Eric Williams was aware of this. But you're also dealing with the fact that the business sector excluded Blacks. There was discrimination in the employment practices. These were very real things throughout the Caribbean, not only in Trinidad and Tobago. So Williams did what he had to do, and the movement dissipated, as it were, but was defeated politically. But many of the leaders continued to be active over the past 50 years, including my friend Kafra Kambon. And therefore, what happened in 1970, the setbacks of defeat, for many did not change the fundamental commitment to the transformation of the region. I think this 70 and the 68 in Jamaica had a huge impact on state reform. Granted, this does not meet what the quotation that was taken from Stokely, from Kwame Ture at the start of the talk, but the reforms were important in making a change in the fortunes of many people.
Thank you very much. I think we have a brother by the name of Frank. His hand is up. So Renee, could you let Frank in? And in the meantime, while you're looking for him, Professor Lewis, we have a question from Rondell Benjamin. He says, I'm interested in the present direction of diaspora studies as relates to cultural composition and the formation of Caribbean basin and the internationalizing of French, Spanish, Dutch, and English Caribbean. and their shared collectivity and evolution. So this broader Caribbean and the issue of diaspora studies.
Yeah, well, if I understand correct, diaspora studies has declined at UWI in the recent past. The area of academic work in which cultural studies is the area in which there is some space for the engagement with the other or brothers and sisters in other parts of the Caribbean. And although in my view, cultural studies takes some of the key areas of Caribbean culture, primarily the music, but there is need for collaboration and work in other areas. But when we speak of this kind of collaboration, we're also dealing with the effort to gain resources to make programs work and to do exchanges, hopefully in a post-COVID world where the physical contact can be restored. What I find is that the areas in which the Caribbean comes into its own are in Toronto, New York, and elsewhere, where the physical presence of people from all over the region has created a sensibility. And of course, Trinidad's carnival, Jamaica's reggae are important areas in which people come together over things. But I'd like to mention that to come back to Africa diaspora, there is the film area, and Nigeria's film industry is attracting the interests of certainly Jamaican actors. And film is, I think, one of the more important areas in which cultural collaboration, not only within the Caribbean, but also with Africa. There are some comments in the chat on Facebook that I wanted to address.
Go ahead.
Please share your observations on the development of the Black business class across.
I was going to ask you that. Yes.
Especially given Marcus Garvey's emphasis on attaining financial independence. I think this is changing, but it's changing very slowly. The Black business class they're speaking from a Jamaican angle. I don't know as much about the Trinidad Black business community. That there are advances in areas of technology. Young people are taking advantage of the technology and developing their own businesses, technology-based businesses. There has been considerable investments in Black businesses in construction in Jamaica, as well as in the some of the locally developed financial houses, some of which have spread to Domrep and Trinidad. And interestingly, one of these houses was started by a very progressive Black woman. So there are signs of changes with respect to Black business in Jamaica. Nowhere near what is required given our percentage in the population, over 90%. You can't say that there's a commensurate reconfiguration of the business class. I don't want to comment on Trinidad. People in Trinidad are better able to assess where the Black business community is relative to the other ethnic groups. That is the key issue that always emerges in the discussion in Trinidad.
A number of our participants are saying that Claudia Jones should be recognized, and I agree with that. So I'm just mentioning that Claudia Jones is among the list of outstanding female civil rights leaders, feminists, Pan-Africanists, who actually straddle both periods that you identified. So
yes, I'm in full agreement with that. There's no debate on that.
Right. So let me see. One comment, if I may paraphrase this. It's pretty long. The question of reparations, this person is saying, Chizoro Okeke, thanks for your comment here. If I do not do justice to it, please put a further comment. But Chizoro is saying that in the context of reparations and citizenship, that the African continent should make certain concessions for homelands for people in the diaspora. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the questions. Citizenship, I don't quite understand what is meant by homelands. I understand citizenship. If the question is about citizenship, this is an issue which I think the government of Ghana is very keen on. Ghana for sure, I can't speak to other African states, but Ghana has made a huge outreach since 2019 to the diaspora with respect to how it is dealing with us. But the question of making lands available, all of matters like those, I think, are subject to NGO groups who have an interest in repatriation, dealing with the governments to which they are seeking repatriation. And this is in keeping with the again, the 10-point plan, which speaks about repatriation. But what I find is that, and I'm referring to something in the chat about have Caribbean governments been in the press for the advancement of people of the diaspora, having regard to the UN Decade of African People. If I could link that in my response to say that the governments move in relationship to what is taking place on the ground. If nothing significant is taking place on the ground on a matter, governments don't really respond. And therefore, when we make claims need to be accompanied by action of maybe one individual, two individual groups of people, because it is the engendering of action through groups of people that attention can be brought and support build up to make the claim. The CARICOM reparation 10-point plan will go nowhere left to governments. It really depends on the populations of the region and their own knowledge and understanding of the importance of the reparative justice system to stimulate governments to take the actions that are necessary.
Okay, I want to recognize Ras Frank. Renee, could you allow Ras Frank to speak? And Ras, if you have control, could you unmute?
Yes, I've unmuted.
Okay, proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Fergus. And let me commend Professor Lewis on a very instructive presentation today, taking us through the history of, as he says, from Garvey to now, from Garvey to Black Lives Matter. I have just a few concerns, some of which have already been expressed by some of the notations that have been posted on the Zoom chat. One, in a real sense, I am positing that the failure of the post-colonial governments was not only in failure to have Black people and Black faces in employment situations, but a movement towards, as the New World movement or group might have positioned themselves as, to a more socialist redefinition of the Caribbean economy. And this might have been brought out then with the 1972 Manley experiments in democratic socialism, or later with Forbes Burnham in Guyana in a similar vein. Of course, all following on the '59 revolution in Cuba. So that's one concern that I would like to hear Professor Lewis comment on. And just to make it very briefly again, Rastafari has been seen as the followers or the children of Garvey. What influence do you think they have contributed to the whole movement of Black power and the sentiment of Black power in Africa in these Caribbean islands? And do you think that enough is being done towards that second point or the third point on the reparations 10-point plan, namely reparations? And what do you think can be done in this respect to further that whole question of repatriation a little more? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, on the socialist movements in the Caribbean in the 70s and 80s, they were politically defeated by global neoliberalism. Global neoliberalism dominated the Caribbean over the past 40 or so years, and it has led to a period of political quiescence among the mass of the population, so that when you speak about 1970 or 1968 Jamaica or 1970s Jamaica, it seems removed from the possibilities and vision of the current period. So that the political defeats were not only Caribbean defeats, they were global defeats. The liberation movements, including the ANC, including MPLA, have all been subjected to the power of finance, capital, the power of the resources of the West. And we are now at a moment in the COVID-19 crisis when cracks are reappearing in the global economic structure, and when the traditional way of governing and of organizing economic relations may not be able to sustain the cracks that will be opening up and are opening up in different parts of the world as a result of this most unusual pandemic. So I'm positing that we have been through a 40-year period of global neoliberalism, of market economics, in which the more flexible mechanisms of state market have been put in abeyance. And we all listen to cable television to hear that billionaires in the world, top billionaires, don't pay taxes. The people making more money as a result of the COVID and so on. So we know that this world order is facing one of its crises. It's likely to face one of its crises. There are changes also taking place. The most significant economic and political change in the past 20, 30 years has been the rise of China. And that China is now the second largest economy. But China has learned that the way that Russia organized its economy is not the way to go. And the state and the market mechanisms which China has managed to organize, that has provided a new way of understanding how poverty can be reduced and how changes can take place in a thing. Yes, we're faced, therefore, with not the traditional type of socialism that has characterized social democracy or that characterized the period after the Russian Revolution. It's an entirely new world economy in which China has managed to marry state mechanisms with market mechanisms. And we in the Caribbean have to study these mechanisms in the 21st century to understand how best to think about the future.
Okay.
The second part of the question on the on the Rastafari movement. Rastafari movement is now global. And however, the repatriation, there is insufficient, there are two aspects to it that I would say. One is that the economic strength of Rastafari is in the music industry, but that the gains of people who are Rastafari in the music industry doesn't benefit the Rastafari community. It benefits those who are in the business of music. The idea of the repatriation, people are in a much better capacity than the generation of the 60s and 70s to organize cooperatives, to have economic initiatives, and to pressure governments both here and in Africa with respect to the issue of repatriation. So my position on repatriation is that it is only going to come with the interest and activities of people on the ground in territories where you have the movement and where people are better organized to be advocates for their own causes of repatriation.
Thank you very much. Underline what you had said earlier then, that if reparations, repatriation, and the other aspects of Black Lives Matter is left to governments here in the Caribbean, it might go nowhere.
Exactly. This is the experience I've had.
Thank you very much, Professor Lewis.
Thank you very much, Brother Ras Frank. And we would have to close in a very short while, but I would want to address two questions from one from Sister Yvonne, Dr. Yvonne Bob Smith, and another from Carla Lewis. Both are localized questions, so I don't know the extent to which Professor Lewis would want to go into details, but nevertheless, Dr. Bob Smith says, what would you say, Professor Lewis, might be responsible for the splinters in the movement in TNT? I guess that's the Black Power movement. And the other question from Carla Lewis is, This one a little bit more contentious. She says, I'm curious to know the thoughts about Dr. Williams not allowing Kwame Ture to enter Trinidad.
Yeah. Well, the second part is easy. Many Caribbean leaders were fearful of Kwame, of Stokely Carmichael when he was Stokely Carmichael, because of his very radical positions. And they fear that he, in coming to the Caribbean, he would be an inflammatory actor. And this was a similar position with the Jamaican government, but I don't identify. Jamaican government was far more conservative than Eric Williams' government when it came to Black nationalism. Williams understood what it meant. In the Jamaican government at the time was very hostile, very hostile to it. But Stokely Carmichael's ban is the same as Dr. Williams not wanting Dr. Norman Gurvan, economist, to continue in Trinidad, Patrick Emmanuel from Grenada, deporting him, Bill Revere from Dominica, deporting him. There's a whole slew of young West Indian academics and activists who were denied access to Trinidad in that period. So Stokely would have been too inflammatory, but such was the case with that. And one should not forget that in the Nixon period, Nixon requested a study of the connections between Caribbean Black Power activists and African American activists. And all of those networks would have influenced Caribbean government activity. So in the inflammatory, I mean, I think some of the activists of 1970 who are now in my age group don't recognize their earlier selves in terms of who they were, may not recognize their earlier selves. And it's difficult to imagine the period. And up to now, I know for a fact, because this is true of people who go through periods of severe trauma. Many of the activists don't speak about what happened in their families, with their parents, their mothers, fathers, their siblings, because it's still after 50 years fairly traumatic. There's a personal dimension of trauma that still attends to many of the experiences of the Black Power movement in both Jamaica and in Trinidad. So splinters in the Black Power movement, I leave my Trinidad colleagues to examine that. But the entire global Black Power movement had differences over time, but the players in Trinidad, many of whom are still alive, are in the best position to explore what that means.
Okay, the trauma is a topic perhaps that we can explore another time, but definitely that has piqued my curiosity, and I'm grateful for you at least bringing it up. I think it's something that we need to explore in a separate session at some time in the future. So at this time, I want to thank Professor Rupert Lewis for honoring us with such profound presentation. And of course, we are left with so much more than we would have come into this program, this session with. And of course, the mention of family and loss of family. I just want to recognize the loss of family member of the Emancipation Support Committee. We recently lost Brother Ifoma Soyinka. And of course, we are still mourning his passing. And it's a sad time for us. There have been so much mortality, so close to so many people, either in their immediate family or in their work circles and so on. So it's a very difficult time for everybody. So we are particularly happy to know that we can still continue with the Emancipation celebrations, the Pan-African Festival, and particularly this event. So I want to thank the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, and the Arts. I want to thank the National Lotteries Control Board for their continuing support. And of course, my team, the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series Organizing Committee, especially, not only, I hope I don't get into trouble, especially Sister Zakia, who is the CEO and chair of the ESC, and Sister Renee Francois for the supreme effort in making this event possible and successful. And of course, thanks to the hundreds in the audience, and especially to those who have contributed their comments and questions. And let me just close by announcing the next sessions in the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. Coming up on the 11th, that's Sunday, the 11th of July, under the theme, Music Get No Enemy, Rhythm, Sound, and Soul as Tools Pan-African Solidarity. That panel would host the following, they would feature the following: David Rudder, everybody knows David Rudder, Wendell Manwaring, Dr. Kayla Francis, Rocky Dawuni, he's from Ghana, and moderating would be Attila Springer. So this is something I'm sure you would not want to miss. On the 18th, that's another Sunday, there's a panel discussion on the role of African film in promoting Pan-African consciousness. And Professor Lewis did touch a little bit on African film and Jamaican actors participating in African film. I was not aware of that, so I'm grateful to hear that. On the following Sunday, that's on the 25th, we have the final panel discussion in this series on reimagining Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. For details on those and for any changes, if they may occur, you should check the Emancipation Support Committee's Facebook page and the website as well, the ESC's website, and you will get information there and updates. So we look forward to sharing your company again very soon. Thank you very much, and do have a good night.